Thanks very much. Konnichiwa, everyone, and good afternoon and good morning to those that are listening also from the European angle. Actually, you've had a look into the legal aspects from Olivier, the technical aspects from Nick, and so we are now looking a little bit more into business and commercial aspects in order to have a look at the market in particular, as this market is currently for many people a little bit of a gray or green scale area. You may have not heard about the name Namiral. It's actually one of those now currently 238 names on the EU trusted list. And so it's a qualified trust service provider. And actually, it's a group meanwhile. So there are other names that are also on the trusted list, such as, for example, Wanataka. Wanataka is another qualified trust service provider that actually belongs to the group I'm working for. I'm responsible within Namiral for communication, business development, marketing aspects, and covering that market for the last 24 years in various roles in various organizations. So the background on which we are looking into that from the angle of the group I'm working for is that many organizations are looking for solutions that they can work on globally. So whether it is with Japan, whether it is with other countries in Asia or in the Americas, in Africa, and so not just on a European basis only. So that's the background of that. Namiral is a privately owned organization. So in the qualified trust service providers list, you have organizations from different background. But this is not about the company. We are looking into the market in itself. And the market is typically not just digital trust services, because they in some way need to be connected with use cases. Otherwise, there is little or no adoption. And if you look into the typical scenario of electronic signature, then qualified electronic signatures or advanced electronic signatures are typically connected with signature workflows. So we do have some overall market perceptions. There are literally hundreds, meanwhile, of vendors that are offering some sort of electronic signature, most of them basic electronic signatures. If you look on the EU trusted list, and that's a publicly available statistics, then you can currently find 238 players for trust services and roughly 160 that are offering certificates for qualified electronic signatures. However, most of them are limited in some way to national use cases, specific industry use cases. So we are expecting that there might be a huge sort of consolidation in that market for a bunch of reasons. You have heard about requirements such as NIS2. They are hitting the market October 17, 2024. It becomes a little bit more expensive to actually operate and run qualified trust services. And on the other side, we have financial impacts. So the fourth bullet point on that list becomes even more important now. Many vendors are struggling to remain or become profitable. And so they are somewhere in between. They need to raise prices, but the market doesn't allow them to raise prices quite often. So if you look into the historical development of that market, then you can also see that in several countries there have been market exits because several use cases that were announced by governments didn't mature at all or were heavily delayed. With regards to the basic electronic signature, well, many use cases that have been addressed throughout the pandemic were use cases with basic requirements. So where there was no actual need for qualified electronic signatures, but there were also use cases implemented where national laws have not been fully looked at. So, for example, temporary employment contracts in Germany, well, you do have to use something that complies with the written form. So you have to use a qualified electronic signature. So in these cases, several so-called signature fails happened. And so we are seeing that the quick and dirty adoption throughout the COVID pandemic also come along with several issues in being not compliant. We are seeing in the third bullet point that the market is now characterized by many shades of grays among the vendors. I've told you already that the Namiral group sits with the name Namiral in this trusted list with its brand with one entry in Italy. But we are seeing new players that are entering this list, and they are entering based on PKI or Trust Services as a Service. So the actual technology is provided by another vendor. In our case, it's the company Wanataka in Spain that is offering that service, and several companies that are listed in this trust service list are relying on this kind of PKI as a service, or you can call it trust services as a service. So there isn't a full transparency with regards to who actually is providing the technology if you just look on the names in this trust list overview. We are also seeing that there is now a sort of shift from one vendor that has been applied to the other. So with all those basic e-signature use cases, the vendor stickiness is not as high as with deeply integrated use cases. So let's look into that a little bit deeper. When we look into the vendor landscapes and how they are covered, so we do have a few consulting organizations, for example, like Observatorium Biz, based in Poland, and Nimbus Network, that are doing market overviews about the qualified trust service providers. Other large consulting organizations, the usual big ones, they look into the e-signature and digital signature vendor landscape. Well, so what are the basic, let's say, stuff that they have seen in the market? Well, in the huge market of e-signature, there are a few large players, such as DocuSign or Adobe and a few other ones. As I mentioned before, many companies are now looking for replacement options. So the private sector typically addresses the market not from the regulated use cases first, but typically from the easy use cases in HR, so the unregulated use cases. There are vendors like Nitro. Nitro bought, for example, Connective, a QTSP based in Europe, and they almost all have integrated now some sort of qualified trust service provider. They either have this within their own portfolio. We saw that already quite a while ago with DocuSign and DocuSign France. And we're seeing this now with several other players in the market. And we are seeing that many vendors are not just looking into one QTSP only. So you can see here, for example, Conga collaborating with a bunch of qualified trust service providers, which also makes sense from a risk mitigation point of view. So when we look into banks and insurance companies, they often tell us we want to have at least 2 or 3 qualified trust service providers with whom we are collaborating in order to be able to fulfill cross-border activities, and also that we can use already existing certificates that are out there in the market. In general, all of these qualified trust service providers face an economical challenge. So there is an erosion on the revenue potential because of a market that is starting to heat up, and where you can also see that the historically high prices for qualified electronic signatures that often have been considered as too high to be attractive to be actually implemented in processes. So the prices went down, absolutely, and they will continue to drop down. But there is a certain margin that a vendor has actually to achieve. Otherwise, they cannot be profitable, and they would need to go out of business at a certain time. And for all of those basic e-signature requirements, you have heard about the eIDAS 2 trilogue result and the announcement that there should be free electronic signatures. Well, free electronic signatures likely in a way like we are seeing it in Austria. That has been the case in Austria for quite a while with the so-called Handysignatur, so that the government provides the opportunity for citizens to sign in the government to citizen and vice versa process with a qualified electronic signature. In the end of the day, there is no free lunch. Someone has to pay for the service of a trust service provider. And so whereas these basic free e-signatures are subsidized in a way with other services of companies like Dropbox or Adobe. So you'll buy a whole package and the signature part is a smaller part of it. So we are seeing this with qualified trust services that someone in the end will need to pay for it. And in many cases, it could be actually the taxpayer. That's something where we expect that in the member states, we may see different approaches of who's actually paying for it. It is interesting to have a look at this map that is in the statistics of the European trusted list on the website on a historical way. I'm mapping this now for a few years and trying to identify the ups and downs and in which market we are seeing new players coming in. Basically, one thing has remained very stable. The proportion of the top 3 countries that are having the most players in the market. And that's still Spain, France, and Italy. And those 3 countries, well, the role of the respective public administration was that they fostered digitization and the usage of digital certificates. So what they've actually delivered is they delivered use cases that were really wanted by the citizens, so that there was also a desire to actually sign up to use a digital certificate. Whereas in other countries, like my own one, Germany, there was a real struggle in terms of delivering attractive use cases to drive the actual adoption. So in German law, well, there is, of course, a regulation for using trust services. But if you look into the public sector law and explanations of explicitly, for example, promoting the usage of electronic signatures or seals as an alternative to paper-based transactions, you can rarely find this cross-reference. You even find legacy stuff from years ago, decades ago, blocking use cases. Like, for example, still in our employment law, when it comes to the provisioning of the conditions of an actual working contract. So that's something to all lawmakers in the world. Think about to actually use the toolbox. We typically call it the eIDAS toolbox to move away and provide alternatives. You in Japan, you have an embracement with stamping and stuff like that. But explain as soon as there is a legal applicability that there is an electronic alternative, and try to identify that there are several stumbling blocks in the national law where you typically have that little term. It is explicitly forbidden to use an alternative. As long as that is not updated to the digital age, you might still find that your own country may just have 1 or 2 or 3 qualified trust service providers, and they are actually struggling to not just become profitable, but doing a real business at all. Germany has a history of market exits because of overpromising by politicians and not delivering to provide the actual laws. So on the other end, In Italy, in Spain, and in France, you also have a wider range of privately owned companies. There is really an ecosystem of trust service providers, and also based on, let's say, an innovative approach, a pragmatic approach from supervisory bodies, they are also able to provide their services in other countries. So in Europe, in the European Union, and in the European Economic Area. So in my case, actually, I'm working as a German citizen for an Italian company, knowing that I have seen large banks, large insurance companies welcoming the broader options and the faster access to innovative options, as, for example, compared to a politically driven agenda of what is applicable and what isn't in Germany. So there is a huge story behind all these numbers on that map. With regards to the landscape that we're looking into and the motivation that drives the European digital identity and the European digital identity wallet, it's this currently still very, very scattered landscape of the digital identities and the remote ID proving systems that are out there. If we look on this just from the angle of the public sector, then we sometimes tend to forget that there are digital identities with a wide adoption range. In the case of Italy, it is in two cases. It is the national ID card with the abbreviation CIE and the Italian digital identity system, abbreviation SPID. Well, we are seeing that the adoption is typically driven by use cases primarily in the private sector. So in the Nordics, it's typically the bank IDs. In that map, you can see there is not a green dot for every European country of the European Union. When in 2021, the exercise with the proposal on the revision of the European regulation on electronic identification and trust services was started, only 14 countries had a notified electronic identity system. Back in Germany, we had an adoption rate for our national ID card and its electronic identity of, well, some say it was 6%, others say it was 8%. It was definitely on a very low level, and this is where it still sits, with something like in between 12 to 14%, depending on which kind of survey you believe in. Well, that was due to a lack of use cases and of actually use cases that were attractive enough to be really used. So this scattered landscape that we are seeing over here is a challenge for trust service providers, because, you know, we do have to identify someone that we are providing with a certificate. And so if someone wants not to sit just on a national business or just serving one industry only, then you'll have to integrate several of these systems that are relevant for the market. And so with serving a global organization, in our case, for example, Allianz or Mercedes-Benz, that want to identify not just a German citizen or an Italian or a Spanish one, they actually expect that many of these that are relevant to each country are adopted, are integrated and leveraged for certificate provisioning. And so what's the case as of today? Well, you'll have to undergo an assessment supervised by your national supervisor with a conformity assessment, case by case, for each of these systems. And you can guess that this is a little bit of a painful exercise, and it's not something that can be done overnight. So with looking on that structure, some sort of standardization and some sort of, let's say, interoperability, harmonization is also highly welcomed from a player in this market. You've heard from Olivier already about the new trust services. What's currently now being screened by almost every trust service provider are the details of the trilogue, of the final result that concluded November 8, and where meanwhile the paper that is out and to be discussed in the ITRE committee, we are now digging into the details of these articles and their potential interpretation for implementing acts, but as well as the potential interpretation from member states of how to actually convert this on a national level. If you receive the PDF, for all those that want to dig down deeper, there are some links included in here. In the PDF, these are active links and they are actually pointing to the sources. What has been done as an exercise on the German level is that the companies are now trying to map the actual roles and responsibilities of those players under the new eIDAS 2 ecosystem. That's a more complex approach, not really suitable to dig into conversations with, for example, people that are responsible in a bank within the first 30 minutes of a conversation. But if you extend and go into a workshop, that material, by the way, is publicly available. In Germany, there is an open consultation in order to build an ecosystem. We've learned our lessons the hard way. Back in the days when the eIDAS 1 version came up, Germany wasn't really able to have a sustainable ecosystem for trust service providers and also for business cases built around it. And so, meanwhile, the Federal Minister of Interior attempts to include those players and also attempts to identify business cases around, for example, becoming a qualified electronic attribute attestation provider. There are some unknowns in this conversation. The access to authentic sources. So are these authentic sources already fully digitized? If not, when? Who is actually to be contacted for these authentic sources? Is it on federal? Is it on state? Or is it on communal, on local level? Germany is very federally organized. So there is, on the one hand side, this, let's say, theoretical approach for the access to authentic sources, but how does it work actually in practice? When could a sustainable business model be established? We've heard from Nick that the standards might be available end of 2025 if things go well. If you want to become such a QAA provider, and if you want to have a successful conformity assessment, at which point in time is likely a conformity assessment body able to provide that? That's something that we need to understand. And so we now go into, okay, so there are the several opportunities. There will be an increased need for identification, for provisioning of attributes, and there is also an increased need for the orchestration of the whole process. So that's the opportunities for qualified trust service providers. Now they need to understand where they are sitting. So the business plan, what can be done in 2024? And we can easily realize, okay, so the initial announcement back in 2021 that there is a need to provision a wallet by 2024, well, meanwhile, that's by 2026. So this is kind of the moving target overview. I haven't seen something officially from the European Commission lately. So we've tried to map this, and this is something I'm updating almost on a daily basis. Last week, we had the final trilogue, which was initially planned for Monday. It was on Wednesday. And so there is the legislative process. The large-scale pilots, initially, officially, they started in April, formally. But potential, for example, was kicked off in July. And what they are waiting for, well, you can see the interdependencies with those arrows in this overview. And one of the interdependencies is in the large-scale pilots, they are waiting for the reference wallet to be provided, so the actual software to be working with. Officially also for more details on the architectural and reference framework. And there is a lot of political influence in the whole thing in here as well. So the open question is, does actually eIDAS 2 deliver finally more or less harmonization in the whole process? I cannot answer that currently right now, but in the last conversations we had at ENISA Trust Services Forum, many do believe that it might even provide less harmonization, because there are national policy decisions in the game as well. This is from an overview from the German implementation of the eIDAS overall system and slides that are also publicly available. There is on the national level sometimes a national policy decision. In the German environment, for example, no distribution of blockchain or distributed ledger technology. Why that? Well, we had our severe fails with premature launches of what we had, for example, as an ID wallet back in 2021 in September. So there are political influences on the national level that you also have to look into. And so what is on one of the national levels activities around digital identities? We just recently had a relaunch of our official government app for the German digital identity. We call it Ausweis app, that has been criticized for not being very user-friendly. So another key aspect, you may have a lot of trust in what we provide with certificates and with the ability to create signatures and seals, etc. In the end, what matters is user experience, because we are in a sort of competition with the Apple Wallet, with the Google Wallet, Samsung Wallet. So wherever there is the possibility that it's not mandated to use a complex and not so user-friendly process to achieve something, to get something done, users may tend to go for the easier option. And so in order to be attractive, UX, UI is key. And also not to overpromise when it comes to delivery of something. Our smart electronic identity in Germany is now meanwhile delayed for 3 years. And the start is even delayed until a little bit further because, as you can see with the second asterisk, we are still waiting for the financials to be clarified for the actual operation of that system. So that's kind of a reality check. And for those that want to dig down deeper, if you are also even considering in Japan or other countries to go for building an ecosystem, understanding if there could be sustainable business models, that's the approach that, for example, Germany has taken in this. I don't talk through these slides. They might provide you, if you're using as a PDF, with a kind of guideline on where we're standing. And of course, I'm welcome to dig into details deeper. We've heard about that, what Olivier is not considering as a pilot, because it's not so clear if this is going to fly after the financing timeframe of the European Commission, but rather as projections. These projections reveal the complexity of the whole thing. So if you look on the amount and list, and if you can guess the various interests in a consortia that is compiled of about almost 150 companies, Namiral just being one of them, then you can guess that this is like building Europe within those consortia as well. So there is also to be understood that there is different political angles of influence in it. So for example, in our case, we are looking on use cases such as the remote qualified electronic signature for signing documents. And this initiative is chaired actually out of Austria, and our Namiral French subsidiary initially started in this, so that's why we are flying under the French flag. To understand that this sort of huge complexity, well, what are they working on currently right at the moment? First of all, catching up with the actual timeline. That's the internal timeline within potential, and you can see already some marks that are indicating the actual delays that we have been experiencing. So there has been no actual work on implementing the example of the reference wallet that is still due to be officially handed over. What they are working on is to identify actually the business cases that are sitting around, like what is relevant for those large-scale pilots. And so that is what is, in a nutshell, currently what we are dealing with. And so as I'm hearing my clock ringing, we're actually on the hour, and I can hand over to Sashi-san again.
プレゼンテーションはポリスコロナ